we're moving the focus of this session from what we've previously been discussing in the breakout groups up to the kind of national level of policy making, to think about the opportunities and challenges that national policy presents. You've heard about some of those just now in the Minister's speech. How as a sector we can make best use of them to progress the early intervention agenda, and we have a range of speakers for you to address these issues, from politics, from the practitioner community, the local authorities, the voluntary sector, and so on. So we're going to have 5 minutes from each of our speakers, and I'll say a little bit more about them in a minute. Then we'll go into a Q&A, and in between that we'll have a little poll to ask you about your priorities for the challenges facing children and families over the next year. And then, as I say, we'll be able to go into a discussion and debate to finish off our conference today. So our speakers, we've got a really great set of speakers for you now on the panel. They're each going to speak for 5 minutes. The first of those is Donna Molloy. Donna is Director of Policy and Practice at the Early Intervention Foundation. Welcome, Donna. We then have Jenny Coles. Jenny Coles, who is the President of the Association of the Directors of Children's Services, who I can see on my screen over here. Jenny, a big welcome to you. Then David Simmonds, a Member of Parliament for Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner, a member of the Education Select Committee and a former trustee at the Early Intervention Foundation. Then we go to Kaya Comer-Schwartz, who is Deputy Leader and Executive Member for Children, Young People and Families at Islington Council, to give us a perspective from Islington. You're very welcome. And then Michelle Lee-Izu, who is who's the Corporate Director of Development and Innovation at Barnardo's. So a big welcome to you too, Michelle. So I'm going to ask Donna to start us off. Donna has led the work at the Early Intervention Foundation to communicate and drive the use of evidence since 2013, and she's got enormous experience in government before coming to the EIF. She's well known to many of you, I know, for her work up and down the country in leading the use of evidence in this sector. So I'm delighted to have you with us here today, Donna, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Nick. I'm going to make 3 points about how we make sure that effective early intervention is at the heart of services for children in 2021 and beyond. And whilst these might all seem rather obvious, I think it's important that we say them. The first is, we do know what works in many areas, but we are still not doing it. The evidence from child development provides clear messages about how best to support children and families, and we need to follow those messages. In exacerbating long-standing issues and inequalities, COVID has in many ways highlighted what we knew already about the importance of protecting children's mental health, preventing adverse experiences in childhood, supporting parenting and parental relationships, and so on. All was a priority, but perhaps never more so than at a time of such increased stress for families. And there is evidence as to what support is most effective in all of these areas, but all too often we aren't doing these things. One example of where we know what to do, but perhaps aren't doing it as much as we could be: evidence for intensive home visiting in early years. This is a well-established way of preventing child maltreatment and supporting the home learning environment. This is probably one of the best evidenced areas of early intervention, as many people listening will know. And yet, at a time of concern about adverse childhood experiences, increasing domestic abuse, rising rates of harm to very young children, and so on, we hear that services are moving in the opposite direction, with frequent reports of how increasing caseloads means that health visitors are struggling to carry out mandated contacts and have a lack of time to prevent the trusting relationships that we know are needed to support more vulnerable families. And so the simple fact is, there are some things that have been well tested and shown to improve outcomes, and we should be delivering more of them. My second point is that if we want to improve outcomes for children and families, we must build the UK evidence base in areas where we still don't know what works. There are too many areas in the UK where we still don't know enough about how best to support children and families on issues such as domestic abuse, neglect, parental substance misuse and others. We urgently need to test approaches that are being used to build our collective knowledge about how best to support families. One example is the need to improve understanding of how best to support children affected by domestic abuse. This is probably one of the most urgent areas for early intervention right now, given what we know about the impact on children on concerns about rising prevalence. Yet, despite the near consensus on the importance of this issue, local services often face a lack of effective support options on which to draw. Work that EIF is doing at the moment to review UK interventions is finding very few with good evidence and lots of activity in this space that hasn't yet been evaluated for outcomes. We need to do some urgent testing of the most promising approaches in the UK so that we can support children and families at risk of domestic abuse with services that have actually been shown to make a difference. And government has a vital role to play here, both in supporting local areas to evaluate their services and making sure its own central programmes are well evaluated. It can sometimes feel that we're on an endless hamster wheel of funding short-term, largely unevaluated activity, and every government department that funds innovation programmes without evaluating whether new activity has had an impact is missing a vital opportunity to generate learning that we urgently need. My third point, which is perhaps the most obvious of all, is that urgent investment is needed to provide a comprehensive, high-quality support offer for vulnerable children and families in local communities. I'm sure I won't be the only person on this panel to make the funding point and about the need for sufficient investment in early help and non-statutory services. And it's great to see the announcements today about developing family hubs, but to succeed, they will need to be able to do more than draw together existing support in local areas, which we all know currently can be far too limited. Effective early intervention is not cheap, but there is a strong economic case for increased investment. Leaving issues unresolved in childhood has far-reaching consequences for later life, leading to increased costs on public services. We all too often get caught up in debates about the potential for early intervention to lead to short-term savings, but we mustn't miss the bigger picture of the long-term benefits to society and the wider economy. DfE have estimated that individuals who achieve 5 or more good GCSEs have lifetime productivity gains worth around £100,000 on average compared to those young people with qualifications below this level. And getting this right is crucial to so many of the things this government cares about. We cannot level up different parts of the country without providing children with the skills they need to succeed in life and mitigating the negative impacts of poverty and other types of disadvantage. And so the long-awaited 3-year spending review is next year, and this is an opportunity to see a new concerted approach to improving life chances for vulnerable children. And whilst it's good to see recent funding for troubled families, family hubs and so on, what we need is not individual initiatives, but clear government leadership and overall vision for vulnerable children, built on the evidence of what works to improve outcomes and backed by sufficient investment.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Donna. Some very clear priorities there. Thanks very much indeed. Our next speaker is Jenny Coles. As I mentioned at the beginning, Jenny is president of the Association of Directors of Children's Services, been in that position since April this year. Qualified as a social worker, I think, in 1986, and has been a senior manager in children's social services since 1997, becoming Director of Children's Services in Hertfordshire County Council in 2010. So Jenny, a big welcome to you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to speak today and talk about putting early intervention at the heart of the children's agenda. And I'll follow on certainly from what Donna has said to us. The pandemic has changed everything, our home lives, our work and the communities we serve. It has shone a bright light on society's inequalities, and potentially with a looming economic crisis, we know that the circumstances of growing numbers of children and families will continue possibly to deteriorate as a result of the long-lasting impact of COVID-19, leading to a growth in levels of need for help and support. And whilst children's services might not have the same public profile as the NHS, appreciation of the tireless work and practical support of social workers, teachers, nursery staff and youth workers in sustaining many children, young people and their families through the last few months has grown. The Minister has mentioned the welcome announcement around family hubs. Indeed, children's centres and family support workers aren't just nice to have. They help families work through difficulties and emerge stronger. Even before the pandemic arrived, it was these very same services that were at the greatest risk of being lost. A decade of sustained reductions in local government funding has resulted in a realignment of spending in children's services, away from early help and universal support towards more intensive targeted child protection efforts and this is not where we would want to be. And we can't carry on as we are. There needs to be a radical rethink about how the totality of public funding in a locality can be brought together. This would reduce duplication and help us make real progress towards the shared outcomes public services, the voluntary and community sector are all working towards: happier, healthier, safer communities. This transformative thinking is happening across the country, but not in every place. And the next iteration of the Troubled Families Programme could provide a national vehicle to do this. The delay of the 3-year spending review was disappointing, but there was a collective sigh of relief amongst directors of children's services when the Troubled Families funding was confirmed for another year. This programme is the bedrock of our family support infrastructure, and our abilities to step in and prevent harm would all but be lost without it in many places. We know that there's plenty of thinking going on in MHCLG and beyond about the future of the programme, and indeed the Minister talked about that cross-departmental work which is so important both nationally and locally. Going forward, the ADCS believes in an all-age, multi-agency prevention strategy should underpin troubled families. Mainstreaming this resource rather than it being a standalone initiative could make the funding go further, helping us reach out earlier, draw in our partners and improve outcomes for children and families. Schools, early years and further education settings have a lot to offer in this space, and the wider children's workforce, including early years and youth workers, must sit at the heart of this strategy. And again, the Minister talked about that integrated offer. COVID-19 has turned the whole world on its head. This moment represents an opportunity to be bold and tackle the inequalities and the structural barriers many children and families face head on. ADCS continues to advocate for children and young people to be put at the heart of national recovery plans and to highlight the family-shaped gap in national policy. Prioritising the health of the nation or the health of the economy has been represented as separate choices by the government in many ways. Well-being rather than economic performance should be at the heart of new policies to create a better and more equal society, and that means stepping in as soon as possible to stop challenges from escalating or stop them from occurring at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Thank you for putting the perspective and the priorities of the ADCS to our conference this afternoon. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is David Simmons MP. I mentioned earlier the Member of Parliament for Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner, and from our perspective a former trustee at EIF and a real champion of early intervention, member of the Education Select Committee, but also chairman of the Children and Young People Board at the LGA, so a very strong local government perspective too. David.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick, for the introduction. I think the starting point with this question is how we bring early intervention out of the shadows in terms of government policy and put it very much at the centre of thinking. And we've heard really good expositions from speakers about the impact that early intervention has and the research base that's there to show that. And when we compare that with the things that are debated when we talk about what we want to do for children in this country and where we spend most of the money on children in this country, we don't see early intervention at the heart of that. And I think my contribution is about three things that I think need to happen to enable early intervention, to make that journey out of the shadows from being something that's seen as a slightly fringe academic discourse about children's services, and then to use that evidence base to really change the way that we think about policy. And I think those three things are, firstly, looking at the way that money flows around the system and the way those resources are deployed to support children, to think about the structure of the services that we provide around the children and young people that live in our communities, and to think about the timescale that we apply when we talk about what we're doing to support children and young people. Perhaps starting with timescale, early intervention by definition is about getting ahead of problems before they become serious and insurmountable. But so much of what we do in all spheres of policy is about things where we try and measure an outcome over a year or 2 years or 3 years. And as a minimum, we're looking at a child's 18-year journey through the system that we provide to really understand the kind of outcomes that we achieve And we know, especially for young people who come into the care system later on, it may well be in their mid-20s, even their 30s, before the positive impact of those interventions begins to show its place in that person's life course. And I think we need to have a debate very much about how we're seeing this, not as something which produces an immediate result in the way that a child protection investigation is focused on, but this is about making decisions that have that long-term impact. The second point about structure. People have talked very passionately about how different parts of the system make an incredibly big difference. And the introduction of public health into local government is a really good example of that, where there's been a very high expectation that this will allow us to do so much more by joining up services. And in practice, what's happened because of those structures is that often contracts for things that we've done for a long time simply rolled over and carried on happening. So we need to think differently about how we break down some of those barriers. Who are the people within the system who can be focusing what we need to do to support this child, very much in the way that Troubled Families does, rather than on silo-driven approaches that exist in the NHS, in different government departments, and also in different parts of local government. And then the final thing about the money. One of the things that's very striking when we look at the evidence that comes in front of the Education Select Committee is that just in the school system, the vast bulk of the money that we spend on education goes on secondary education, despite the fact that everybody knows you get the most impact from the money that you spend in the early years. And we hear a lot of debate about finance, a lot of people saying we need more money in the system. And yet if we look at just the schools budget, there is around £240 million nationally in school deficits. There's £1.4 billion in school surpluses. The DfE have far more schools they're worried about with excessive balances that aren't spending that money supporting children than they have that are falling short. And we need to think differently about how that money flows around the system, not just about how we're making, on that timescale point, a longer term investment to turn around the life course for this child, but also how we make sure that resources that are in the system at the moment are applied in the most effective way, knowing what we know about that early intervention evidence base.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Evan. Some very important points there about structures, about the funding we have, and about the long-term perspective we have to take when we're thinking about early intervention. I'm sure we want to come back to that in the Q&A. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Councillor Comer-Schwartz from Islington, where she's the Executive Member for Children, Young People and Families. And her portfolio includes arts and culture as well, and the development of a pioneering pledge on cultural opportunities for Year 11 children. And she sits on the Dame Alice Owen Foundation Advisory Board, Islington's multi-agency Violence Against Women and Girls Strategic Board, amongst a number of other appointments. So we're very pleased to have you here today to speak to us. Kaya, over to you.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. I suppose what I'm overwhelmingly struck by in my role is how lucky I am actually to be the Executive Member for Children in Islington, where we've had sustained protected funding prioritised for children by our administration for over 10 years. If we look at our early years settings, we haven't closed a children's centre. We have a fully integrated children early years offer that we call Bright Start. This is an offer where you will see your midwife in a children's centre. You have the voluntary sector giving breastfeeding support to women. You have our play and stays, have sessions on speech development. So it's a really fully integrated offer. You wouldn't know really when you went through the door who was working for the council, who was working for the local health team. It's a fully integrated offer, and we've seen that over that 10 years of investment in it, we've got the UNICEF Gold Star for early years, that accreditation, but we've also seen the impact that that's had on our rates of breastfeeding, on our levels of good development within early years. And if you think we have one of the highest rates of child poverty in London, how important that is. Also, it's not, as other panelists have said, it's not only early years, but when we go on to our early help service, which we formed. We don't call it the Troubled Families Agenda, we call it our early help service. We see over 1,600 families each year through that service. We had an Ofsted earlier this year that rated us outstanding and said that we were making the right choices by those families. We also have an integrated, for the moment, we call it the Integrated Gangs Team, which is our targeted youth support offer. Another fully integrated service. We sit council officers next to CAMS officers, next to the police, next to employment support officers, and that's what's at the heart of all of this is the title of the conference today is that child-centred approach. It's backed up by our trauma-informed approach, by our motivational practice, and that's across all our children's services. So we're really linked up and putting those children first. And as panelists have kind of intimated, when you do that, you see the results. So our last data around shows that 94% of young people were triaged by our targeted youth support, were diverted away from the criminal justice system. So I think what we're saying is when you make the prioritisation, when you accept how important early help is, as David said, it shouldn't be in the shadows because we prove in Islington that it works, it's important, it makes real changes to children's and families' lives. I think given the pandemic we've all been suffering, we've been really relieved to have already made that prioritisation. It's made our reaction to food poverty a lot easier because we know the families who need us. Same with digital exclusion. We've been able to work with partners within business, within the voluntary sector, trust and foundations, and also ourselves and government to get over 2,000 laptops out to children. So it really shows that why investing is really important, but also it shows that when you do invest, it makes a difference, and it shows that what we know about this pandemic is only going to make that gap bigger. And I'm relieved, really, that we've already made that investment because we know that we're going to see an increase in cases. We know how important that early intervention is. In doing that, I also wanted to say that we're taking it beyond what we've already done. We have protected our youth centres as well, and we've started an integrated offer there in terms of emotional well-being within our youth services, which at the moment is particularly important in terms of mental well-being of young people. But also we're looking at how we can go further with those youth workers about how they can be kind of advocates for early intervention. And then finally, I just wanted to mention we're taking this beyond children now. So we're working on an initiative called Fairer Together, which is a kind of taking the Bright Start model or the Integrated Gangs Team model and applying it to everyone, really. How do we get a relationship, a motivational approach to all our interactions with residents so that we can identify those issues early, get this the one person to hold that relationship, but to have a multi-agency support approach behind that, because we've seen how powerful early intervention is. So if there's any other local authorities out there who want to talk to me, I'd be really keen because it really shows that you can make a difference through this approach.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Kai, and it's a very impressive level of commitment to early intervention. Thank you for sharing that all with us, and I'm sure there will be people who want to take you up on that and to indeed ask you questions when we get to the Q&A. Our final presentation is from Michelle Lee-Izu, who, as I mentioned before, is Corporate Director of Development and Innovation at Barnardo's, which is, of course, the largest children's charity in the United Kingdom. I think her services provided to 300,000 vulnerable children, so a huge operation that Michelle is involved with and developing and innovating, and is indeed responsible, I think, for some newly innovative services, which I think she's going to be able to talk to us about today. Michelle, over to you.
Thank you. Yes, I've been asked to particularly talk about our work in terms of supporting children from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, particularly through the See Hear Respond programme. And what we have found during that work in terms of the impact on those children. Obviously, I'd like to just acknowledge throughout the day there's been much discussion really around how COVID-19 has impacted on all children and young people, and particularly during the first lockdown, the closing of a lot of the universal provision, which meant children and young people were less visible through their normal support networks and lost the support of their friends, teachers and professionals. Barnardo's carried out a big conversation at that time with 5,000 children and young people, many who reported feeling more lonely, isolated and anxious. In 1920, yes, Barnardo's supported work with over 358,000 children, young people, parents and carers across more than 800 services. And 19% of those children were from same communities. I'm sorry I've used that term. We're all trying to find an alternative because we know it's not ideal. Before the pandemic, we were aware that many vulnerable children were hidden from view, including those Black, Asian and minority ethnic children. We know that there's a backdrop of structural racism that we've all been talking about, and Joe talked about that in terms of EIF this morning and the work they're hoping to do. But also we know that there are areas in terms of those children who are achieving poor outcomes compared to their white peers. So the children and their parents from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, along with Barnardo's practitioners, have reported that the children have been impacted in a variety of ways by the pandemic. And I just wanted to give some examples because against the backdrop I spoke about earlier, we've seen this additional pressure for these children as a result of COVID. So, for instance, many of the children are more likely to have lost loved ones who have died as a result of COVID. Even when help was available, it didn't always meet their cultural and religious needs. For example, food parcels given in kindness often contained inappropriate food items. Sadly, many children from Muslim households told us that they'd been targeted on social media, wrongly accused of spreading COVID and breaking lockdown rules. And these children felt afraid to leave their home even after lockdown rules were lifted as a result of the threats that they were receiving. Children reported being afraid to go back to school due to the risk of bringing the virus back into the home and infecting multi-generational households. One family's home was actually petrol bombed just because they were Chinese. Although government awareness raising was really important of how COVID was impacting on their communities, this heightened fear and anxiety for some children who became really frightened by the messages and about the impact that the virus could have on their loved ones and on themselves. So one boy from African heritage thought that he was definitely going to get COVID, and he therefore considered taking his own life rather than ending up on a ventilator. Just a few of the examples that we've been told about by children who have been really impacted. You heard today from the Minister that our successful See Hear Respond programme has been awarded further funding until March which we're really pleased about. But as you also heard Jenny say, we do not know yet what this pandemic will have done in terms of impact on children and young people in the long term. Barnardo's bid for DFE funding to set up See Hear Respond, which is an early intervention programme to work with children hidden and vulnerable during COVID. The children who were eligible did not meet the threshold for statutory services. All statutory services had been unable to reach the children, or in fact that local area was so under pressure resource-wise, they weren't able to meet all the early help requirements that were coming forward. We're really proud of what we've achieved, and we knew that we needed to reach high numbers of children in need and to truly address the hidden children, including those in BAME communities. We absolutely knew we couldn't do this alone. We always work in partnership with our statutory colleagues, but we knew to really reach these children, we had to work in partnership, and that was the right approach. So this was key to our delivery model. And when we set out, we thought that we'd probably work with around 20 partners. We actually have developed partnerships with 82 partners, 30 of which were BAME organisations. And together, we reached 39,000 children and young people between June and November. And of those, 20% were from BAME communities. There's been over 235,000 hits on our digital support hub. Our partners have included both large, national and grassroots organisations. And the grassroots organisations and community-based organisations reach children and young people that larger and statutory organisations find really difficult to reach. BAME families reported that this is because these organisations understood their needs, were at the heart of their communities, and they had a greater sense of trust in those organisations. See Hear Respond focused on children and young people at risk of exploitation, young carers, those children under 5, BAME children, and children with special educational needs were at risk of hidden harms. However, we turned no child away, and although we had clear, measurable and reportable outcomes and KPIs, we allowed each organisation to deliver the service in a way which they knew met those children and young people's needs. We have learned so much, and we will continue to learn over the coming months. We have extensive data which we want to share, and we're still mining that data and analysing it. And we have an independent evaluation which is due to conclude shortly, and we want to share with the sector. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Michelle. It's very good to hear of your See Hear Respond programme and the difference it's made, and also that the Minister is able to announce the additional funding for it. Thank you very much indeed for those perspectives. So now we have some time at the end of the day for some questions and answers, some discussion with our conference participants. I can see them in front of me on the screen here, and what I'm going to do is going to take those questions off and feed them to you as panelists to respond, and we'll see who's best placed to respond to different ones as we go through. The first of these, which a number of people have wanted to ask, is that the Troubles Families programme is brilliant, but it is late early intervention in quotation marks and relies on vulnerable children being identified. It was good to hear Donna Molloy recognise the important role of health visitors as a vital safety net. Will the government reverse cuts to the service? Now, we don't actually have a government spokesperson here to answer that question, but I suppose we can. I think it would be important to talk about the role of health visitors and the funding for health visitors. So perhaps, Donna, can we start you with that one?
Yes, I mean, I said earlier, health visitors are vital in providing that intensive home visiting in the early years, particularly to vulnerable families that we know is absolutely crucial to so many outcomes, and our work has shown the importance of health visitor and health visitor numbers. So I think we would agree with the point that's been made here. I think just more generally on troubled families, I mean, we have this conversation a lot, is troubled families late intervention or early intervention? And actually there is quite a lot of discretion locally to decide which families are supported by the programme. Many of these families are large families with a number of children of different ages, and so I think troubled families can be late and early intervention all at the same time. And we know whole family working can have a strong impact in terms of improving outcomes and so on. So I think there is flexibility there, and we would see, as Jenny said, troubled families is a crucial part of the early help and early intervention efforts locally.
Great, Donna, thanks so much. David, would you, I mean, in the Education Select Committee, do you get to range across some of that? I mean, we talked about different services in their silos, but do you get to range across some of these ways in which, say, for example, health visitors can have an impact?
But I think health visiting is a really good example of where we need to get across how the money flows. So there was a very high degree of political priority placed upon the numbers of health visitors when the public health transfer to local authority leadership took place. Yeah. And of course, following the reductions in the overall public health grant, to maintain those numbers of health visitors would have meant a much larger reduction in things like children's mental health services, which are also funded out of that same pot. And I think even today there's a big challenge, because in most local authorities, and I think my local ones are no exception, health visiting still sits and feels very much like a separate NHS-led service rather than part of that local children's services family. So although there are referrals into and out of health visiting services, it doesn't feel integrated. So I think there's also a piece of work to do about how we make that work seamlessly alongside children's social workers and other things for children in a local area.
Okay, thank you, David. Jenny, you mentioned your relief when you heard the announcement of the extended funding for the Troubled Families programme and how important it was to you. I mean, do you think it's a late early intervention, or do you, like Donna, think that actually it can have a very important role for early intervention, as it were?
Well, I think, it sits as part of a continuum, doesn't it? A really important part because of the funding element, but it sits as part of a continuum of support. And in most places links in with a whole range of services, the voluntary sector in schools and so forth, and indeed in children's centres or family hubs. And that's where its value is. And I think what it's brought is a real push for multidisciplinary and integrated working. And some of the projects that have linked into it, particularly, for example, with WP, and the real push on skills and supporting families and individuals to get into work, as well as children in school. So it's had an impact which is far broader than just direct service provision. And I'd just like to add the integrated offer to what David and Donna were saying about health visiting. In some areas, that integrated offer is fully integrated into that family hub and children's centre model. And that's, what I was saying about if you're bringing funding streams and, roles or services together, you can then make the best of your resource, and it also encourages innovation because, at the end of the day, there's probably unlikely, there is a finite pot of money, but my question is, are we using it in the best way we can, both locally and nationally?
Thanks, Jenny. Kaya, is that the case in Islington that you've talked very much about integrating your services using the local authority leadership to do that, but do health visitors feel like still a distinct service, or have you got them properly integrated?
No, we have them properly integrated. We make sure that all of our families are seen by a health visitor. 95% of our families are seen within the first 10 days by a health visitor. I'm pregnant now, and I've had a child in Islington, so I know for a fact that they're really integrated into our services. They make targeted referrals where they need to. For example, CAMS, we know the importance of postnatal mental health. They make referrals into that if needed, but they're really the frontline assessors of that need. And then also very much linked into our more universal offers. For example, when I was a first-time mum, our health visitor led some great sessions around weaning, for example, within a children's centre, but she was the health visitor, you know, so it's really blurring the lines of what we might think as traditional roles. And I think that's why it's so important, because she's the one holding those initial relationships and then developing those and then linking them in to both universal and targeted. So yes, we definitely see our health visitors as key to our integrated offer.
Thanks very much, Guy. Michelle, how about Barnardo's? Do you do a lot of work with the Troubled Families programme, or more broadly actually with health visitors?
Yeah, more broadly with health visitors. So we've got some really exciting innovations at the moment, both in Essex and in Birmingham, where we're part of the integrated offer of health and social care. And we've been working really closely with health visitors. So some of our staff work with the health visitors. So they do some of the role that the health visitor may have traditionally done in the past, like weighing and measuring, which gives the health visitor more time to spend on some of the more, shall we say, clinically focused or very, you know, the areas which only they, as qualified health visitors, can really focus on. And I think at first some of the health visitors really struggled with that, but over time that's really become a really positive way of providing some of those services and ensuring more parents then get access to health visitor time on some of the more health focused issues. I think looking at a sort of mixed workforce that can, as Jenny mentioned, do a range of those tasks jointly, I think that's what we're really interested in. How do you innovate in this space to make sure we can meet the level of demand within those budgets, but to do things really well?
Thanks very much, Michelle. The next question we have it focuses on the issue of trauma. It says we've had very helpful discussions and presentations today have identified community parental, children's and intergenerational trauma, much of it due to structural and health inequalities. So this question of trauma is obviously central to a lot of the research on early intervention, and it also comes to the points that David was raising earlier about, particularly when we focus on intergenerational questions, how do we configure the services that we have in ways that enable them to make a difference over the long term, that we're not just measuring year by year interventions or funding pots, but we're seeking to have an impact on generations and the generational transfer of disadvantage. So I wonder if our panel could just say a little bit about this question of how we bring not just trauma into our thinking, which I know a lot of you are focused on today and know a lot about, but also on this question of breaking the cycles of intergenerational transmission of trauma. Perhaps Donna, I could ask you again.
Yeah, so a lot of the interventions that we look at EIF and that are on our guidebook are very much focused on working with individual children and families in order to build skills, resilience, strategies for coping with problems, improving family relationships and so on, which we know can prevent trauma and early adversity in childhood. But we also know that structural and health inequalities have an impact. Many of the gaps in child development and outcomes that we look at open up largely, although not exclusively, along socioeconomic lines, and we know that being poor has an impact. So I think we would say it's not an either or. We need to look at strengthening families and preventing adversity in families alongside looking at the wider conditions in society to prevent some of the economic conditions that we know can lead to early adversity, which of course gets us into a whole separate conversation about issues such as poverty and the welfare state and so on, but it's certainly not either or. We need to think about both.
Thank you, Donna. David?
My view is that it would be helpful across government to have a strategy that's about childhood. And one of the things that always strikes me about this debate is historically a lot of that debate's focused around statistics. And in particular, we hear the debates about child poverty based around 60% of median income. And of course, the challenge around that is when we talk to people who've been on the receiving end of those policies, the question, has this made any material difference in your life? The answer is often no. I think we need now as government to be thinking, what are the things that we can do that will make a material difference in someone's life? And a lot of that, intergenerational work is an example. So we know in the UK, children spend less time with older generations than is the case in almost any other country in Europe. We know that for many children, if they're growing up in poverty, the opportunities to do things like get work experience, to go on a trip abroad, to take part in certain kinds of sports, if they're in a city, to visit a rural area, to go to a farm, if they're living in a rural area, to go to a city. So many experiences feel like they're closed off. And I think we need to think about what are those experiences that we want to make sure that children can have that can enrich their lives. And adding to some of this research stuff that's very much about shifting some of the dynamics, thinking at a national level, how do we ensure that every child is getting access to these opportunities that we know can have a transformational effect, not just on their personal aspirations, but also from what we know about past generations on what happens to them through their life course.
And just to come to the points you made earlier about short-termism and political timetables, how do you go about embedding those sorts of approaches in long-term policy making, so it doesn't shift minister to minister, government to government, that you have institutions, policies, funding streams which embed early intervention and then enable you to tackle intergenerational transmission of disadvantage over a longer period of time? I mean, that's something obviously we've heard about in Islington in local government, but at national level, how do you think that's best approached?
Well, I think Kaya and Islington's a really good example of being able to join up activity across an organisation. And it's certainly my observation as a new MP that central government's not very good at that. Things are very, very siloed in Whitehall. So I think having things that operate very much in the way that a good local authority does, of saying, this is a priority for government, the people in the Department of Work and Pensions, the Department for Business, the Department for Education, Department of Health and Social Care, Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, I mean, just 5 that have a finger in this particular pie in some respect or other, that those need to come together around these work streams and say, what is it that we want to deliver? And often embedding that is about making sure that we have institutions, probably in this case sitting around local authorities, that have ownership of that in the same way that we sought to do that work around schools. It's become something that's just accepted now, but once upon a time, the question about what the structure of education should be, should we even require children to stay in school till they were 16 or 18? Those were hotly contested things. Whereas now we've got an acceptance, we have a national curriculum, we want every child to have this opportunity, we want to make sure it's properly funded at a national level, and it's embedded in government. And I think we need to have some of the same cultural approach to the way that we support children outside of the school environment.
Very good, thank you. Jenny, what would be your perspective on these questions? You know, I'm particularly interested in this question of sort of embedding structures and institutions for the longer term.
And well, I'm just really thinking about following on from what David said. Children will only do well at school if they are living in a family that's able to support them and they are living in a community that supports education and their outcomes. And so there's something about, and you're right, David, joining up the school bit has happened, and schools as a whole, there's not a school that doesn't do a whole pupil approach, and many, particularly primary schools, are taking, a trauma-based approach to how they work with the whole class, not just individual children, but joining up what we do outside of school. And I think local areas really try and do that. They try and do that in a whole range of things around domestic abuse, around early intervention and so forth. But what isn't helping is the variety of funding streams, which are short term and come with often, sometimes sort of competing approaches. So, and that's the bit about joining up some of this funding to get the best you can. There's a lot of money gone into child and adolescent mental health. There's funding that's going into domestic abuse, 3 or 4 streams there, and to support the new legislation that's coming down. There's funding around projects for serious youth violence. And yet, to bring those together locally is quite a challenge. And sometimes it encourages the agency that's receiving the funding to go off and perhaps not be as joined up as they could be. So a real opportunity to do what we know and base that on evidence, a lot of which, of course, has come from the Early Intervention Foundation.
Thank you, Jenny. That's very good. Kai, can I just ask? I mean, you talked very impressively about Islington. Where did that commitment come from? I mean, give us the origin story, if you like, about this longer-term integration and commitment to it that you described in your remarks. How do you generate that initial, pathway, if you like, that you established for a local authority?
I mean, I think it really did start within the early years space. I think as I said, we've been investing in the early years space for over 10 years now. So I think when there were key decisions around what to do with children's centres post-Sure Start, they took that decision early on to keep that and to invest in that integration. And that has, as I said, kind of grown and become our ethos across children's services. And as I said, now we're looking about how we can kind of take that multi-agency approach into the wider resident space as well. So I think I'm very lucky, really, that my leader of my council was the executive member for children 2 times before me. So in terms of a child-centred approach, we couldn't get much more dedicated in our executive team. So, and that really helps, because when you are having to make exceptionally difficult funding decisions, like all local authorities are, I don't have to have that argument with my colleagues about, should we close the children's centre? It would save us money. My colleagues would never accept that, and it's really they get it. It's really important that they get that approach, and I think because we've taken that approach for so long, it's really taken on. I would like to say on trauma-informed practice that it's something we've really kind of taken and run with, and especially in the exclusion space, we've been working to really reduce our numbers of exclusions, and we've been working with schools to do trauma-informed practice as part of that reduction of exclusions, and part of that is because we're so aware of the disproportionality in terms of Black and Black Caribbean, Black African families in that picture. And we've just done a report with City University on that disproportionality. And what was really interesting about that report was understanding the families of those children within the criminal justice and their experience of discrimination and trauma. And we've kind of taken that and been doing a lot of work funded partly by the Violence Reduction Unit and the council in looking at how we have more parental support workers as well within our targeted youth service, because we really do want to break that cycle. And similarly within the DA space, we've committed £2 million over 3 years to working with that. I have to say that I agree with Jenny that we supplemented that with some MOPAC money, but that's agreed on a yearly basis. And for the VCS partners we work with, that's really difficult for them, especially at the moment, to keep that sustainability. But it's, especially during lockdown, imagine if we hadn't invested that amount of money. And with the amount of cases we're seeing now, and we know within our child exploited children within the criminal justice, the majority of them have experienced domestic violence at 2 years old, 3 years old. It's a key factor. So it's something I'm really proud that we've invested in breaking that cycle.
Great. Thank you very much, Kai. Michelle, Barnardo's has been around a long time. You've professionally been involved in the voluntary and statutory sectors for 27 years. You've seen a lot come and go. How do you think that these kind of commitments to long-term sustainable change are best made? What's it from the Barnardo's perspective?
Obviously, I think that long-term sustainable change, we need investment. Everybody said that, without that commitment, that government commitment to investing and local commitment to investing. And we know that many local authorities are financially really struggling. And when that happens, lots of local authorities do get pushed. So they're at a point where all they can provide is some of those heavy statutory provision, and that's not what any of my colleagues in children's services ever want to happen. I know that. It's just the pressure, so that there has to be settlement for children's services to actually allow that to happen. I think the other thing is once that money's there, how do you think of outside the box as well? So I'm really interested in co-production. We're doing we've got several strategic partnerships around mental health and well-being. One in Renfrewshire, where we're working with health and children's services to look at how might we reshape some of that work, and that's truly around trauma responsive. I think what will be interesting is to look at what comes out of Scotland around trauma responsive practice, given the government's commitment, and obviously in Wales, the Welsh Assembly's commitment around ACEs. So I think looking nationally at some of that learning. And then lastly, what I'd want to say is, how are we developing and supporting our workforce around having these skills and expertise, and particularly around becoming trauma informed? And that's something Barnardo's committed to as part of our 10-year corporate strategy. We're on a journey to become a trauma responsive organisation, and that's a massive piece of work where you have to train all your staff throughout your organisation and look at your policy. So to expect staff to work in a truly trauma responsive way, it does require investment on not just direct delivery, on those who are delivering those services who will have experienced their own trauma throughout their lifetime. We all have, and many people who find themselves in the caring profession do so because they have, they have themselves at some stage in their life experienced trauma. Not everybody, obviously. I'm really interested in that, and we've been working very closely with Dr. Karen Treisman around that journey and how we might work with our statutory colleagues and partners on that journey.
Thanks very much indeed, Michelle. I am just conscious that we had a second poll for you where we asked our participants what they thought the most critical challenges facing children and families over the next year would be, and they had two to choose from. And looking at I can see on the screen in front of me a pie chart telling me what you thought, and 20% of you, a fifth of you, thought that problems with mental health would be the biggest challenge, and then 23% inequalities on the basis of income and locality. Obviously, COVID has had a very a differential impact on people depending on where they work and where they live. And then also people very concerned about school readiness and academic attainment. And then 11%, I think I see there, the relationship breakdown, conflict and domestic problems, and then funding for local services, another main concern. So lots of critical challenges there. We've got about 5 or so minutes left, and one of the questions that's come up, it relates to the conversation we've just been having, which is, how do you enable councils to shift from crisis intervention to front-loaded early intervention to prevent what was once described as the Barnet graph of doom. I think the Barnet graph of doom is where it was a sort of scissors map, wasn't it, where services and demand on services was going up and funding was going down, and you'd meet the kind of crossover point. We've talked a lot already about that question of local authority funding, but I suppose, two things that occur to me that might be useful just to talk about. One is how more local authorities can do what the best do on early intervention. And I know, Donna, that's something that you've spent a lot of time thinking about. We have early intervention pathfinder, local authorities working in partnership, and enabling more local authorities to take the evidence base and deploy it in their policy and spending decisions. And then, David, to come back to your points about, we have a spending review next year, 3 years worth of funding. It's going to be very, very important spending round. what we might expect or what we could ask of government for enabling this kind of shift, which is very difficult to do, into early intervention from crisis interventions, what we can do to prepare for the spending round to feed our evidence in, and what we might expect government to do. So, Donna, perhaps you could start with, how do you get more local authorities doing the best things using the evidence?
Yeah, I mean, I think two comments on this. The first is the importance of local authorities making the case for this agenda in a realistic way, which is based on what we know about what results can be seen and what can be measured in what timeframes, which I know has come up a number of times today. Those local authorities who've argued that investing in early intervention will radically reduce caseloads in children's social care and so on are probably likely to end up disappointed, because we often don't see dramatic changes in short periods of time. So I think it's about being realistic about what we know from the evidence, about what results we can see, and how best to capture those, and what are the valid and reliable ways of measuring those changes over a realistic proportion of time. And just a second point is, of course, this isn't just about local authorities. Increasingly we're seeing partners in police, health, schools and others equally committed to this agenda and with resource to invest. And I think some of the areas that have been most successful are those that have successfully created a shared endeavour in the place based on a commitment to this agenda and using the evidence about what works to improve outcomes.
It's a really important point, Donna. Some of the best police services and partners in the NHS, it makes a real difference. So you're absolutely right to point that out, that it's more than just local government, vital as that is. David?
Well, one of the things I'm learning is that I'm not sure it's the beating heart, but the heart of government seems to be with the Treasury. And the question that they will always ask of any bid for expenditure is this going to be funding statutory duty, something which we require a local authority to do, or is the thing that's being put forward something which is essentially discretionary? And the big challenge with everything around the early intervention space is, because we don't have good evidence of how it saves money, that case is very, very hard indeed to make. And certainly just from my local government experience, as a council, we could spend millions on programmes helping to divert young people away from crime, which would save the prison system loads of money, but that makes absolutely no benefit whatever to the local authority's bottom line. So being able to join those things up across the system, in my view, is absolutely critical if we're going to make that case. And then I think the second big part of it is the duration over which we think. It's about recognising that often the things that we need to do are not going to be about the very subtle changes, the moving from 59.9% of median income to 60.1% of median income. So suddenly you're not living in poverty anymore, even though nothing in your life has changed at all. We need to think about some of the grosser interventions, the opportunities that children need to create that intergenerational change. And we need to focus around showing how we can deliver those, because those are the kinds of early interventions which I think it's much easier for government to understand. It's much easier for politics collectively to identify are delivering. And it moves away from the kind of ratchet effect that we've seen. Who remembers the Neighbourhood Nurseries Initiative, 2004, abandoned in 2007? Once upon a time, that was the only game in town and the big national strategy for early years. Then it was got rid of. We need to move away from that kind of thing and have a much more sustained agenda about what it is we want to achieve for children.
Thank you, David. Jenny, what will be your priorities for the spending review then? Will you be making similar sorts of arguments?
We absolutely will. All local authorities will. But I suppose what's come to mind for me, it's not just local authorities. It's absolutely not. And those areas like Islington and indeed my own, who have lower rates of social care and specialist referrals, are those where local partners have joined and have committed resource. And there's something about bringing that message together, isn't there, rather than just local authorities making the case for early intervention, both locally and nationally. And if ever there was a time now, children's services have been monitoring and really modelling what they think the impact on children and what kind of services are going to be needed as we go over the next year. And what is absolutely clear is we need to help young people at early stages, whether or not it's around anxiety or getting getting back into school or stopping them getting involved in antisocial behaviour and crime. And so, you know, this is an absolute time for doing this, because if we don't, the impact is going to be felt for an awful long time. And there'll be a whole group of, you know, and I don't want to sound dramatic and say a generation of children, but children who will really lose out and will find it very, very hard to catch up.
Thanks, Jenny. Kai, can I just ask you, I mean, we were just talking a bit there about the police and other services alongside local government. Can you say a little bit about that and about your relationship? You talked earlier about, I think, about some MOPAC funding, which is a London Metropolitan Police body. Can you just say a little bit about how you've done that kind of partnership working, the joining up between local authorities, the policing and other statutory services?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with the panel members that have identified that collaboration is the key to this. You know, we have been massively cut, as many local authorities are. So we couldn't do this level of investment, this level of protection if we were doing it on our own. And I think it's about obviously collaborative budgets. So, you know, we work very closely with our local health partners, but it's also about collaborative time, culture and investment of that. So with our voluntary sector partners, you know, they are really signed up to this model of working, and they put a hell of a lot of time and resource to working alongside us. And also our police, as I mentioned before, we have the integrated gangs team where we have police officers sitting right next to youth workers and our targeted youth service, working cheek by jowl. And that's a decision and an investment that our local borough commander stands by. And it really, really works. I mean, in terms of culture, what I've seen, I've only been doing this job for 2 years, and the discussions we were having with the police in the early parts of those 2 years, like, oh, well, you know, once a kid reaches 17, it's very difficult, to officers, you know, sitting outside with a child that they were worried about, who was, you know, while we could get a social worker to them for hours because they're so invested in our child approach. So I think it's really thinking beyond the financial, but really adopting the child-centred approach and understanding that partners want to be part of that part, you know, really, you know, really sitting with them and explaining why. And I think it's what you were saying about the invest to save. It is a difficult part of the evidence, but actually I think it goes beyond that. I mean, we obviously have still very high rates of poverty within Islington, but it's about the outcomes for those children as well. And I think all of us across our partners are really dedicated to unlocking that potential for our children and really giving them the best start in life.
Great, thank you very much, Kai. Michelle, I think the last couple of minutes to you. I think, I mean, you spoke very eloquently earlier about these issues of structural racism and discrimination, and I just wonder whether when thinking about your programs, the funding for them in the future, and when we look forward to the spending review, how far can we bring these kinds of perspectives to bear upon the funding and spending decisions we make, as well as the reform of services?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, those inequalities generally, those health inequalities we've talked about, and for all children and young people are really, really important. But I do think this period this year, I think, has given us all an opportunity to think and reflect further about particular groups where those inequalities may need slightly different approaches. And I think that's what we really need to think about. And I think we can't use some of the approaches we might have always used, because we know that those have not improved those outcomes. I think there is a question about how do we, or I'm going to use a term I used earlier, how do we co-produce new ways of addressing old issues. So how do we co-produce together as a sector, statutory, voluntary, private sector, but also how do we put those service users right at the heart of that journey, and create new ways of addressing some of these old issues that we've really, we're really struggling with and not finding solutions that we would want to seek. And so really understanding what works and how we test that, because right now I don't think we do know what works and what's going to really make a difference in terms of addressing those inequalities, particularly where we've got those sorts of structural issues such as structural racism.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Michelle. Well, I think that brings us to the close of this session. So I want to thank our panel very much indeed for their contributions. It's been a really excellent discussion and debate. I hope that all of you watching, participating in the conference feel the same. I've really learnt a lot. It's been really great session. So thank you very much indeed for your time, everybody. I'm now going to sort of shift myself over to the lectern, and I will say just a few words by way of closing for today's conference. But once again, a big thank you to our panel. Thank you very much indeed.